further delay, I'll let Sean talk to you.
I've actually been on the job 5 months and 2 days. This thing slides. I came here from the Messenger Post Media in Canandaigua, New York, where I was the executive editor for a daily paper and 12 weekly papers in the Finger Lakes region of New York. Beautiful area, great things that would come out of it. My start in newspaper journalism, though, was here in Texas at the Beaumont Enterprise. I started as a copy editor many years ago after graduating from the University of Florida. And one of the things I love talking about is how I got the journalism bug. When I was going to college, I worked at the student newspaper and was working there at a time when really one of the biggest stories that had ever happened in Gainesville happened while I was there working as a student journalist. And that was in 1990 when they had the University of Florida had the student murders, where 5 students over a period of 5 days were found dead, brutally mutilated, and scared everyone. It became a police state very quickly. You would go to bed at night hearing helicopters flying over and spotlights going everywhere, and I was a student, so I lived in an apartment, and I remember going around with the apartment manager making sure everyone's outdoor lights were on. It was that scary. We had, at the time, the guardian angels had come down to help police the streets of Gainesville because everyone was so scared, and they ended up beating up a jogger for no good reason, and then they had to leave. But during this time, it just got very scary, and they actually ended up shutting down classes, and everyone, for the most part, left town, except for those of us working for the paper that continued to try to press and get as much of a story for our readership, the University of Florida students, as we could. And the very interesting thing, this was it's hard to convey how much of a media circus this was. We were competing against the daily newspaper, the Gainesville Sun, which I eventually worked for as well. But we had, at the time that this really hit its peak, satellite trucks up and down pretty much all the streets. CNN was there, everyone was there. But us being, again, the local newspaper with responsibility for protecting and informing the local community, we really took it seriously, even as students, to try to press and get as much of a story and as much of context as we could, and staying on top of police and what they were doing and doing the updates, and going around knocking on doors, asking people how they felt, what they were doing to protect their safety. That's really when that adrenaline rush of being on the front lines of such a huge story at such a young age really stayed with me. And to be at this point still in newspaper journalism, you're offered several opportunities throughout that time that if something came along, hey, you want to go do something else, I find it very difficult to ever consider leaving journalism just because that adrenaline rush, that connection I have with my community when I'm reporting on some of these big major stories like that. And that's, I think the basis of really how I approach being the editor at the Denton Record-Chronicle. We're in the middle of a very big metroplex in Dallas-Fort Worth area. There are only 3 daily newspapers that publish every single day. The Dallas Morning News, Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and the Denton Record-Chronicle. And that's a lot of competition, but our core readership is northern Denton County. So the way we approach it is that even though, yes, that is within the backyard and certainly within the sites of the Dallas Morning News and the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, we're going to own coverage out of that area. We're going to present or better report the news for our readership, with our readership in mind, than anyone else. We're going to try to have within our pages stories that are an accurate reflection, a wide reflection of our community, all the different areas, all the different segments, which is one of the reasons that I am very excited about the project that you're undertaking. The Transformer series is that, for me, trying to reflect ways that people that aren't necessarily making the headlines, but are creating and affecting change within our community, finding a way to profile that and bring that to the attention of our readership, that's fantastic. That's what we really want to do. We want to be able to show the different dynamics, the different struggles, the different successes within our community. We want to be able to present information that empowers our readers to ask appropriate and direct questions of those that are in positions that make laws and affect the livability of our community. And that I got through a lot of the stuff I've done through journalism. I've only been at the Denton Record-Chronicle for 5 months, but it is the third Texas paper I've been at. I started at Beaumont Enterprise. I also was the managing editor at the Herald-Zeitung in New Braunfels. I've worked at the Florida Times Union in Jacksonville, the Gainesville Sun, which is where I've probably worked the most. I did 2 stints at the Gainesville Sun, but I've been on the front lines in addition to the student murders, some pretty major stories, and again, trying to find ways that despite who might be there, if there's a media circus, finding ways that are accurate, that to present the story in an accurate and reflective way of our community. Some of the stories that I've covered, I was in Alexandria, Louisiana, when the Gina 6 marches and protests took place. And that was a big story. My family, my parents actually live in Gina. The reason I moved to Alexandria was to be closer to my parents. I wanted my son to have time to spend with his grandson. Never imagined that I would be there for, and the timing was funny. I left Florida, Gainesville, to go to Alexandria, Louisiana after the 2004 hurricane season when Florida had 4 hurricanes go over it at the same time. I said, you know what, I'm tired of this hurricane stuff. I got to get out of here. I'm going to Louisiana for 2005's hurricane season. That was a big mistake. But I was there for Katrina. I was there for Rita. I was there for the Gina 6 marches. And what's interesting, again, thinking about how, that was another very competitive, you had international, BBC was in Gina interviewing people, CNN, Fox, everyone was there, finding ways that we could be better, ways that we could devote attention and resources to that story that the others could not. I mean, they came in, a lot of times they'll come in for the march, they'll parachute in, and they'll go quickly. Well, we, in advance, were able to go through the court records and present what was in the court records that they had not done. But we also knew that, all that many people for a march covering that it's going to be very difficult to report your news on your cell phone. So we actually set up base camp in my parents' living room using their internet to post our stories. USA Today, which is the Alexandria paper, is a Gannett paper, they posted their stories from my parents' living room. Got gumbo that my parents made. They were very excited. And we had radios that were on different frequencies than everyone else so that we could communicate to our reporters back and forth. But it's that approach, I think, to trying to anticipate, put in the resources, put in the homework to cover a story that, again, enables you to present the best story for your readership. And I've had that happen a number of times in my career. Another one 8 years ago, yesterday, I was in Gainesville when the Dove World protest happened. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that was the preacher that was threatening to burn 3,000 Quran on September 11th, and they did eventually do it later, and that was actually, if you remember, was the initial excuse for Benghazi was that they were reacting to the video of the guy burning the Quran. That was the guy that I ended up covering. But again, we had all this media that parachuted into Gainesville to cover this, and trying to think, how can we do this differently so that we're able to get a better story, get a story out sooner than the others, putting in the homework. We knew that this event was going to happen, so a week prior to that, I drove throughout the neighborhood and found a house for rent and worked out a deal with the owner to where we could set up shop in his house for 2 days to cover this thing, have internet access so that we could post our stories to the web very quickly while everyone else is struggling with the cloud. So it's that type of approach, that's the kind of approach that I want to be able to take at the Denton Record-Chronicle, putting in the resources, the attention, the homework to try to tell our stories in the best way possible and make that emphasis on local coverage. Is certainly where my passion is. And again, that's really what we're talking about here with the Transformers series. A passion for telling compelling stories. A passion for being able to, and this one is a great one again, as far as you're highlighting people that may not be making the headlines, but certainly are making a better community, trying to find a way to tell it in a way that people that are not, readers that are not familiar with these situations, these people can still appreciate their story, see it through a different set of lenses. That's, I think, our emphasis is at the DRC as well.
Do you think when you are handling the local aspects of a national, of a story that has national reach, do you think you do a better job reporting it because your sources are local and you know the community so much better than someone who's parachuting in?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've already developed the sourcing. They're starting from scratch in that particular instance where we've already built a level of trust. We've already been, at the shift changes for the police department. We've already been to Gina. We have friends and family that are already there, so we know it a little bit better. The thing that was, and we actually, and the Gina 6 was a very interesting story in that, it was very controversial, a lot of misinformation that was presented. Again, there's a lot of the old shoe leather approach to journalism. We went and pulled the court records and reported from the records, and many of the national media didn't have the time or didn't have the inclination to do it. So there was context to our story that was missing in some of the others. We continue to, that's going to be a challenging story for any community. And the response that happened in Gina, and the response that happens so often, if you have something happen within your community that you don't want to talk about, they don't talk about. We had a tough time getting people to talk. You would get one side, and we're trying to get all sides, and that was tough. But because we were there and we continued to work at it, we eventually did get that balance that was missing in some of the reports. And I think in knowing a little bit more of the nuance of the community, it's funny, Louisiana, you can tell when someone is familiar with it, and the pronunciation and the spellings. We knew that. We knew how to pronounce it. We knew how to spell these different town names and different things. And so we had that connection that came through in our copy.
In terms of your journalism journey, you've been at a lot of different publications. Were there points in your career where there were hiccups because the economy was bad and it was a pretty tough job market?
Yes.
Yeah, and did you experience that yourself? I mean, and how do you ride through that? I mean,
I did. It's.
Did you have to flip hamburgers for a while or anything?
Well, I mean, right off the bat, when the reason I ended up in Beaumont, Texas, after graduating from Florida, the University of Florida in Gainesville, I had been in talks with the St. Pete Times. I was thinking I was going to end up there, and I was excited. And then we had a recession hit, and they had a hiring freeze. I needed to pay the rent. So I went back home to Louisiana to try to, they weren't charging me rent at the time, and try to find a spot. And I ended up in Beaumont after my cousin found the job there. But in Alexandria, I mean, it's in Alexandria, Town Talk is a Gannett newspaper. And I was there, from 2005 to 2008, right before the presidential election. I had just been promoted to managing editor when Gannett decided that all papers this size and below don't need managing editors. And despite, I led this team. We had won so many awards. I was sitting talking on national panels. And we argued, my publisher argued, and they said nope. And that's how I ended up in New Braunfels after that. And that's, that afforded me the opportunity to take a look and say, you know, I could have gone into PR, I could have gone into, you know, at that time you're looking at whatever you can do to pay the bills. But this is a tough thing to leave, a tough gig to leave. The adrenaline rush, the access you have. You know, I when I was covering the Gina 6, I sat in a church pew, one pew behind MLK 3 and Al Sharpton. I mean, you're right there. This stuff is happening right in front of you. It's hard to leave that. You know, that's part of the compensation, because you don't get rich being a journalism, but part of the compensation is that you have access, you have that experience. So I had a chance to reflect and say, what do I want to do? And my decision was I want to continue doing what I'm doing. So I went and was the managing editor of New Braunfels, and was there for a little bit of time before Gainesville called me back, and I ended up being the assistant managing editor for news there. But that was certainly, and that's, you know, you develop, I think, an appreciation for how decisions are made in media companies. And one of the things that I love about being in Denton is that the Denton Record-Chronicle is an independent paper. It was bought back from Belo last year, and so local coverage decisions, local funding decisions are made locally and with our local market in mind, which is important, because too often, you know, Gannett, Gatehouse, they'll make decisions regardless of the market, just based off a scale. And you know I can talk about some of the decision making that I think that has hurt newspaper journalism. At the time when I was in Alexandria actually had the best penetration rate as far as how many people within that community were picking up that paper of any paper in Gannett. And it's not. I mean, they've actually reduced, as many have, and it's a struggling time. It's a time of disruption. They've reduced to, I think they print just 3 times a week. A lot of papers are going that route, and you know, it's tough to build reader loyalty when you're pulling back. And the good thing about the Denton Record-Chronicle, I think, is we're pushing into it. So it's a good situation for sure.
That's what I was going to ask, actually, what you want to try to accomplish with the Denton Record-Chronicle, and it's obviously driven, but yeah, maybe just some things that you're looking forward to.
I'm looking forward to, you know, telling some great stories out of this community. This is a very, it's a news-hungry community. It's a very engaged community, very responsive community. A lot of news is happening. And being able to empower our readership, the community, by giving them information, you know, setting the discussion that then leads to decisions being made. That's, I think, our goal. But you know the greatest satisfaction I take, and I shared this earlier at the early class, is, you know, knowing that we are bringing or helping our community improve by being, you know, unvarnished, fair in presenting the information. One of the greatest thrills I had when I started off in journalism is going, you know, to cover a meeting or sitting in a meeting, and during the public comments time, someone asks a question based off of a story that we had written. And they're asking questions, they're pressing their leadership based off of information that we had provided, the context that we had provided. And that, I think, is what we're trying to do. You know, and again, with the Transformer series, it's so easy to talk about, you know, change, but what does change feel like? How does it manifest itself? Who are the faces of change? That's a lot of, you know, you don't see that as often in newspapers. We get too hung up sometimes in the data, in the numbers, in the approval ratings and things like that, but you don't see the faces, what it really means, how policies really hit home with people, how, you know, what a living wage really looks like. You know, these aren't great demands, you know, big demands to see, you know, what is it that is needed within our community. If we're able to highlight that and, you know, inform people, our readers with that information, it's going to make for a better community. And it's a community in which we live. You know, that's the other thing that we like to point out. We're impacted, we're affected by the same stories we write.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that, Denton being a small town, you rub, shoulders with a lot of different people, with a lot of the same people. Is it hard? I don't know. Do you feel like, are you, of course, we're independent, we're journalists. Like, I don't know, have you ever worried about like, I don't know, offending certain parts of the community or certain people that are in leadership here? Because, it is a small town and, there are powerful individuals everywhere, but,
Right. I think we're mindful of it. I don't think it affects us. We're mindful that, we're gonna ask tough questions. We're gonna publish stories that certain people are gonna be ticked off about. They don't want that information out there. In election time, we're gonna go and we're gonna ask tough questions and we're gonna report the responses. And yes, not everyone's going to like it, but as long as, it's accurate, it's fair, we're asking it of every side, I think that's the approach we're gonna take. And it's, when we cultivate sources, then we make sure that everyone knows that, this is a working relationship. We're gonna be cordial, we're gonna be respectful, we're gonna be fair, but we're also gonna ask very difficult questions. We're gonna ask for information that you don't wanna give us, but is public and we should have. And, we're gonna have sources. I don't think, our goal is to not have some source that's just absolutely in love with us because we're not doing something right. We want them to respect us and know that, okay, yes, they're gonna give the good, they're gonna give the bad. And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think as long as you can take an ethically justifiable, defensible position, that's all that anybody can expect from you.
Mm-hmm.
If you can be fair but tough, if you can be transparent and accountable, then you've answered your public service sort of obligation.
Right.
And you're right, there are always going to be people that you piss off, but that's sort of the nature of the animal. That's just doing your job,
Yeah.
and that's what we do. So, now there are instances where we don't act with the kind of integrity we need to. There's certainly a story out there now. Are you familiar with what's going on at the Houston Chronicle? Or
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, with the reporter, yeah.
But that's are you guys familiar with what's happening? There's a reporter there, longtime reporter, used to be with the Austin American Statesman, and he was caught fabricating quotes, people that just didn't exist. And this fabrication is one of the great ethical sins that we can commit.
Jason Blair, yeah.
Yeah. So, but who's the person who turned him in? It was another journalist, and he didn't do it out of spite or ill will. We are ethically obliged to do that. And what's happening now is that the Houston Chronicle is going through some cathartic moment where they're having to look at all of their reporting and all of their editing, and they've hired someone to look at all of his stories. And we do that in the interest of being transparent. We do that in the interest of being accountable. And that's also part of our ethical obligation as well. So, and what's the ultimate result of this? It's to build trust, and because we feel like we've broken trust.
Mm-hmm.
And when this happens at the Houston Chronicle, it's bad for all journalism. So
Mm-hmm.
we have to sort of purge ourselves of these situations, and we do it through the ethics of our profession. So,
Right, right. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I do have a question actually. When you go into a career, you've lived some life, you've become a part of organizations, you have your own opinions and your own, personal biases. People are just a part of things, like they're Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and part of the LGBT community and all those things. But have you ever had people that you worked with that maybe you knew personally were involved with organizations like
I haven't had it happen all that often, really, and it's almost treated like, in golf, you call your own foul. That if you think that there's a story you're approaching that you think might create a conflict or might give, by your covering it, give ammunition to someone to criticize or take apart your reporting, that you stand up and say, I don't think I can do this. But I have not had it happen too often. We're encouraged as journalists certainly to be a part of the community. We're members of churches, we're members of different service organizations, the Rotary Club, Kiwanis and the like. And that's good. You develop sources, you have a better appreciation for different segments of the community as a result of that. But I wouldn't, if I were a member of this church and I heard of a great story at that church, I would suggest the story be done. I would not suggest that I do it. So I think there's opportunities for you still to make sure that stories are told, because we want to tell good stories. But if you think that there might be something a little tricky about your covering it, then certainly suggest a story that someone else covered.
I think our ethical obligation with conflict of interest is incredibly high, because it's not just the impropriety or the conflict of interest, a real conflict of interest. You're going to kind of know that, but it's how it looks to the outside world. It's the appearance of impropriety. It's the appearance of a conflict of interest, and you have to sort of have this sort of second sense of how does it appear to the public, and that's where things get tricky, and that's where you really have to be sensitive. Yes, ma'am.
You're talking about conflict of interest. What exactly constitutes a conflict of interest? I know you mentioned LGBT, so if there was a story in the LGBT community, you wouldn't let a gay person cover it? Where exactly do you draw the line? What is?
No, and like I said, it doesn't happen all that often. It's only, and you want, whatever stories you're telling, you want those stories to have integrity, and you want those stories to be able to stand, you don't want to introduce as a part of the reporting process an opportunity for someone to criticize that reporting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not suggesting that would be the case there. Again, that I wouldn't necessarily have an issue with a gay reporter covering a gay issue. But if that reporter were a member of a particular organization as part of that, I wouldn't want that reporter covering that organization. That, I think, is where the conflict comes. That someone could say, well, hey, you're not going to be, and they're probably right, you're not going to be as critical of that as another person coming at it without an attachment.
So we shouldn't take into consideration identity factors when talking about conflict of interest?
What do you mean? Just
race, gender, religion, stuff like that?
Again, I think you don't want to have any attachment to the story that can be used against you, and usually that's not going to be the case. I don't think anyone's going to legitimately or logically be able to pick apart a story because an African American person covers something out of the African American community. It only comes, I think, when you get very intimate to a particular group or you're part of that story that you want to pull back.
I think it's a question of divided loyalty. Our first loyalty is to the public. And if that loyalty gets compromised because we also have this overarching loyalty to an organization or a church, and so that we're going to put them in a more favorable light than we might otherwise do if we hadn't been a member of that church. And I don't think it applies to race or religion or things like that. But if your loyalty, if your obligation to the public interest is compromised, then because you also have divided loyalty to something else, to a person or an advertiser or an organization, then you get into a sort of a conflict of interest situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering though, because I know, there's, an effort to like diversify newsrooms and like more so like some people who like maybe have more experience to cover stories so that they can cover them more accurately. So that's what I'm wondering, like you know, what constitutes a conflict of interest and what constitutes like maybe someone having a little bit more like chops to be able to cover a story more accurately.
Well, most of the stories are going to be assigned to the beat that you're covering. If you're covering a particular segment of the community, you have ownership of that beat. You have authority within that beat. It would take a really big conflict of interest for you not to be the person covering the story coming off that beat.
So,
I have a question in regard to the Transformers assignment,
Uh-huh.
in regard to beats, actually. Since, you know, the purpose of the different beats is to cover all the bases in a community, and we're gonna be writing these Transformer stories, and these different people we're writing about will fall under different categories. Would you want us to, in some way, like email or communicate with the person, like if we were writing about someone who was a teacher, communicate with Caitlin Jones, just like education stories, or Peggy Heinkelwolf, it was like something about local politics, or?
You can. I don't know that you would need to. Again, what I think that is really excites me about this series, this project is the uniqueness. You know, someone coming at it with fresh eyes. I'm not saying Peggy or Caitlin or their eyes are, you know, blurry on but someone coming at it with a completely fresh. There's some. There's really something that's going to come out of that. There's a power in approaching something with fresh eyes. And I would like to see what you're able to do in approaching it. And again, getting down to that really intimate level as far as really putting a face on the people that you're profiling. And you know, that's a human story. That's not necessarily a beat. That's really trying to put that human story into perspective. Yes?
Whenever you're covering politics, do you ever find it difficult to be like objective and unbiased, or is that something that's just natural for you?
Well, I'm everyone. We're all going to be biased. It's the trick is not to portray a bias. When we're covering politics, and it's tough. It's you know, and I don't want to say it's tougher in this environment than it has been in the past, but you see the same talking points used against you. Oh, you're biased, or you're a left-leaning newspaper, or you know, right-leaning, whatever it might be. Our approach to it is the way that we protect ourselves in that instance is that we approach every story the same. Politics, government, education. If there are two sides to an issue, we're going to talk to two sides. You know, however many sides there are going to be, we're going to make an effort to get as much of that in there as possible, so that, you know, we have the different facets of that particular issue represented in our reporting, and then we'll stay on top of it. We'll continue to, and you know, this is something that happens to us in politics and elections, that you know, someone didn't like our reporting that we had done on another story, so they decided they're not going to talk to us. And it's tough to present balance when there's only two people running against each other. One of them will answer the phone, the other one won't. But staying on top of it and continuing to press other members of the public to put as much pressure as we can to obtain that balance that is our responsibility to the readership. And it is tough, but it's a challenge that we willingly accept, and we're going to stick with it as far as really pressing people to try to respond to it and try to reflect that. Yes?
What would you say would be the biggest challenge you face, like, in your career, and how did you overcome it?
Oh, goodness. You know, it's I've been in newspaper journalism long enough now that I started back in the salad days when everyone was flush with cash. I hate to date myself by saying this, but I started before the internet was really out there. And you know, we had all this money. We had no problem hiring people. As soon as someone left, you were able to hire someone. You know, go down the line now, and before I came here to Denton, the biggest challenge I think I faced was just this changing journalism model, newspaper journalism model, where resources are very tight, and you can lose a person in what you believe to be the most critical beat that you cover. And because decisions are not made at a local level, you're unable to fill that position immediately. So trying to find ways to still, the readers don't care. They don't care if you have enough money to turn the lights on or not. They want to make sure the story is accurate. It's there on their lawn at the time that they want it. So working within the challenges of declining resources and still delivering news that is impactful, accurate, fair. That's been a challenge that I've been dealing with for a while before I got here. Now again, it's so refreshing to be at the Record-Chronicle, where it is an independent paper now, where local decisions are made on a local level. I don't have to deal with that as much anymore, but that was an issue. And in certain cases, you see that, I think, reflected in some of the declining readership that papers may suffer. It's hard to build that lasting loyalty when readers, and they pay attention, they see, wow, my paper used to be 25 page or 26 pages and now it's 16. They see the declining number of pages, they see the declining number of local stories, the local resource. They see that your reporter used to come and cover my meeting and now I don't see him. So it's hard amid that environment to still have that wide base as far as what you're covering and still have that loyalty. So that's probably the biggest challenge I've had to cover. And so how I've done it is, we at that point, there are no silos in a newsroom. If something happens that we feel our readers need to cover, it's whoever I see in the newsroom, you're going to go cover it. I don't care what beat you're in. It's got to that point. And one of the stories that that we did well with in New York, I mentioned it earlier, when we had an officer involved shooting in which a person went and did a welfare check on a parole officer, and within 2 minutes of entering the building had shot and killed the person. And we did a story, and right away we were able to develop that, yes, it was a parole officer that had been shot, but the police didn't want to identify the officer. And we put in a public records request and they said no. And then we started doing stories. Talked to I was the editor at the time, and because I had everyone out doing a lot of these other things, I was the one making the calls to the First Amendment Center in New York to try to find, and they were outraged that this is absolutely public information, it should have been given to you right away. So I would work hand in hand with the reporter. She was at a meeting or a press conference and I'm writing stuff, putting it on the web. So in times where the resources are tight, you recognize that readers don't care. They want that information. So we all chip in and do what we need to do.
I think that's the challenge of journalism in the 21st century, is doing more with less.
Yes.
Doing more journalism because, we've got to do the video and we've got to do the print and we've got to do the photography with fewer resources, because there are less of us to do it.
Yeah.
And there's less money to do it with.
And the challenge at the Record-Chronicle, this is my guiding principle of what we're trying to aim for. We want to be as local as we can get, because again, there's 3 daily papers, the Dallas Morning News, Fort Worth, and us. We want to be, you're going to see the same wire stories in all those papers. We want our front page to be local news. That's how we're going to stand out. That is our hallmark. That's our value, is in our local coverage. We want the inside pages to be as local as possible. We want to, as much as we can, push out the wire. Now we're going to have to have some wire content. We don't want people to have to pick up our paper and another one to be able to be informed about national issues. We'll still have national coverage, but we want as much as we can to have local content within that paper, and understanding that the resources now are limited as opposed to 10 years ago. It requires us to be creative on how we do this. A lot of that is things that we do now and newspapers do now that, when I started out 25 years ago, I can't remember the last time that we had a community or a paper submitted from a community member that we ran, or things like that we're turning to members of the community that can help us reflect content, help reflect coverage in our paper. We have partnerships with UNT, we have partnerships with the NT Daily, we have partnerships with NT TV, we have a partnership with the Dallas Morning News, Channel 5, ways that we can pull in as much as we can local content that has relevance in our community while still having, you know, a finite number of reporters.
So the Denton Record-Chronicle covered UNT's football's last victory, I guess from Saturday, and I read the article in the Dallas Morning News. So are you selling that content now to the Dallas Morning News? Or?
No, it's like it's a partnership. They're not, yeah.
So you haven't completely severed in that
Well,
regard?
we've completely severed, but we have a handshake agreement where they, again, the Dallas Morning News still has the same challenges we do in covering as much as you do with the resources you have. They don't have a UNT reporter. We do. So we provide coverage to them of UNT athletics. We look to them for some, I mean, we've run their stories on the officer involved shooting there in Dallas. We've run those stories from the Dallas Morning News and try to pull those as much as we can. We'll pull some of their opinion columnists, their opinion content, but there's no money. We'll share photos. But we now, and it's taken a lot longer than you would think to fully cut the umbilical cord. But we're now on our own system, our own server, and everything else. So we're getting very close to being fully part. Yep.
So the stereotype is that younger people don't read newspapers as much. Do y'all have like readership demographic data? You know, who reads?
We
Who's
do.
Clicking.
That's not necessarily true. They may not read the newspaper, but our same story is online, and we're getting a ton of traffic online. One thing that is unique about the Denton Record-Chronicle's website is that we do not have a paywall. Most papers, pretty much every paper now these days has a paywall. You can only read a certain number of articles before you have to subscribe. We don't have that just yet, and we're not planning to. But so our reach is pretty wide. We get a good number of page views per month. We get over 1 million page views per month on our stories for a relatively, you know, Denton likes to call itself a small town. It's the biggest small town I've ever seen. Yeah. It's but
small town feel.
Yeah, they maintain that small town identity, but boy, they're growing. So we are getting more of that. And you know what the challenge is, I think, from a newspaper is we want to appeal. You know, if we don't appeal to the younger generation, we've got 20 years left, if that. We've got to find ways to appeal, and the way that you appeal to that demographic is to reflect that demographic. We've got to have stories that touch the lives of younger people in our pages, and we've got to find ways to reflect the challenges, to reflect the successes of younger people, and then find ways to promote that so that you know that it's in our paper, you know it's on our website, you know that we're putting it on our Facebook page, we're tweeting it out, we're getting it to you in the format that you are most comfortable with, but you know it's there. That's, I think, one of the biggest issues is that, we say younger people don't read the papers because they don't know what's in the paper. We've got to find ways to let you know that these are the stories that, if you read them, it's going to make you, put you in a better position to improve your life, to raise questions about how money is being spent for your education, money is being spent in different ways that affect you, so that you can ask questions and demand answers as a result of reading that. Yes?
Going back to what we were talking about earlier about being a part of like a certain community and like covering them, how do you, I guess, kind of like watch yourself to where like you're not always assigned those like articles? Like, for example, like I'm African American woman, and of course I like love covering my community, but how do I not always get assigned those? Because everybody wants to have diverse like change beats or want to talk about different things. So how do I, like, if I'm working in a newsroom and I'm like one of the only African American people, how do I kind of just tell people like I don't want to always be the person to cover the African American community?
Right. Well, I think you have that conversation with your editor, but I think from the editor's perspective, I would hope that they recognize, again, like I was pointing out with the Transformer series, there is a certain power in approaching story from new eyes, someone that maybe isn't as familiar with the issues, the challenges, that can reflect it in a different way. Now, there are stories I'm sure that you're going to want to cover, and you raise your voice on that too. Hey, I want this story. But others that you say, you know what, this probably is best for someone else. I think we have to be open in our communication and communicate any concerns, or, you know, and you don't want readers to see that either. That's the biggest thing. You don't want readers to say, oh, well, you're the African American reporter. We don't want that. And you want to be able to show that we're coming at it from all kinds of different perspectives. Yes?
I know earlier you were talking about doing more with resources, and another thing that I was talking to our Christian about was a lot of students come to the board and they always think they're one-dimensional, or they can be one-trick ponies.
Mm-hmm.
And I even think about back then, to Thorne, you could probably attest, a lot of guys were just photographers, or they were just writers, or they were just videographers, or they were just PR strategists. And when you think now, most people almost have to do everything. I think about Marsha Erler, she's a perfect example. She's a DOP at DMA. And she says, well, nobody on my staff can just do photo. They can also do video. They also have PR skills. And what do you think that most kids should be doing right now to build up to be in the positions that they so-called want to be in?
You know, it's that is the environment in which we are in now. I mean, it's funny. I work at a newspaper, but we're producing video. We're producing, some podcasts. We're doing photo galleries. We're doing all kinds of different mediums that back in the day, newspapers just didn't do. Now, we do know we'll have sometimes reporters will shoot photos, but if it is a story where we have if it's a big enough story, I want a photographer, staff photographer shooting it. So I think it's identifying those opportunities, those different stories we're covering, where it makes the most sense to have someone with the expertise that we need for that to do it. But I can't say that you're gonna be free from not having to do some of the things we're doing. I mean, social media is also another thing. A big part of a reporter's time now is taken up with promoting, engaging, participating in social media, as well as reporting stories, developing sources. So there's all different facets, I think, to being a journalist now. But as far as photographers shooting photos or shooting videos, I think we look at it on a case by case and see where it makes the most sense to apply expertise where it's most needed.
I think one of the reasons why Thorne and I are trying to sort of have this pilot project and sort of merge the classes is so that the print students can get a taste of the multimedia video projects that you're doing, and the video students can get a taste of print, and so we can have this kind of convergence and have this conversation between our students as well. So that's more of what you're talking about also. Wouldn't you agree, Thorne?
I love throwing journals together in collaboration, so that you have defined responsibilities, but the expertise of each bleeds over into the other.
In regard to that, I wasn't sure if, because this is our normal class time for the students for feature writing, but I know that there's some people visiting from the other class, and I wasn't sure if we were meant to share our pitch ideas, because I know some of the people are coming today that won't be able to make it to the meeting on Friday, you said?
Yeah, but that's next week. So
It's next week.
I think there'll be a couple of opportunities next week. So if you wanted to talk to Sean about it and bring it up in the class, that's up to you. But if it's, I just don't know that we have. I mean, you could talk to somebody after class, but right now it might be a little difficult to implement that.
Exactly.
Yes.
I have another question.
Uh-huh.
I wanted to get your own opinion, like with other journalists that you've worked with and everything. What do you find that's like the most valuable and most impressive, like in your peers who you like grew with in your career, and things that were striking that you
Well, absolutely. I've had the privilege of working with some very, very good journalists. Right from the get-go, as far as when I was a student at the school paper, covering a big story. We were there at all hours of the night I was the news editor at the time of the paper. The editor of the paper, of my school paper, went on and later in her life won a Pulitzer. She went to the Miami Herald and did a fantastic story on housing there, and then ended up getting at the Washington Post. So I certainly had the privilege of working with her. But I think the thing that I find that is the most important quality in a good journalist is that curiosity, but also the tenacity, because you're going to get poked, you're going to get pushed, you're going to get bullied, and you've got to be able to find that gumption to go right back and insist. I mean, we see it an awful lot, in the instance on trying to pursue public records that everyone's saying is public, but the government is refusing to release, and being unabashed. And we had a front page story saying it's been 6 days since we made this request, and yet everyone says it's public, and yet it has not been released. Eventually, it was. So having that backbone, that confidence to be to know your stuff, and that's important. Confidence comes from knowledge. We have confidence because we know the public records law. We know what we're entitled to, so we have that to be able to push back against different things. But as far as a lot of I've had the pleasure of working with some just great managing editors. I think my bosses were some of the best. When I landed at the Beaumont Enterprise, the managing editor at the time, his name was Bill Mock. He had come up through the paper in Baltimore, was just hard as steel. Just that really grisly type of editor that would just really instill that old school appreciation for journalism. And I actually I was the news editor at the. I eventually rose to news editor to the Beaumont Enterprise, and I got in trouble with him once because I'd be trying to edit a story, and he's in it reading it, and I said, "Good gosh, we're being mocked again." His name was Bill Mock. He pulled me aside and said, that's really funny. Don't say it to the rest of the people. But being able to work with people that have that appreciation for the responsibility we have, the importance of journalism, how much our country depends upon what we do, because without us it would be free reign. There would be rampant abuse, and knowing that's where we are, we're the protectors in that, and having that instilled in you is very important. And I think that I benefited from getting that very early on.
Back at I'm just going to comment. Back in the old days, and I'm not talking about the beginning of the internet. I'm in the 30s and
so now you've
40s.
Mine is the old days.
Yeah, and there was a movie called Front Page, and it really sort of reflected the division of labor back in the day, because there was the reporter who was getting the story and essentially filing the story, and they'd call the person up on the phone, and they would give that information, that factual scenario or whatever it is, to somebody in the office who was the rewrite guy, and they were the ones that would actually write the story. Now we don't have that luxury anymore, if it is a luxury, because to have all the tools, you have to be a great reporter and you have to be a great writer. So you have to be a good craftsman, and you have to have that kind of tenacity that Sean's talking about. And that's where we are now as journalists. So, you had something.
Okay, I have to ask if you might have seen it, but I'm the opinion editor for Interdaily, and I was wondering if you saw what we ran on page 8 a few weeks ago about funding cuts and stuff like that, and sort of.
This came up in the
I saw it an hour ago.
And just your sort of thoughts on the continually diminishing resources and funds for student media and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a very unique challenge that you have at the Daily with your reporting on the source of your funding, the source of your viability. And it's a unique challenge, and one that, the paper I was at in Florida started off under the umbrella of the university and became an independent paper because of that same difficulty. Just that, stories that we would want to do, the administration would not want us to do. So there's difficulty in that. Now, I think that, you can make arguments on either side on the approach to it, but I think it's important as part of being transparent in your readership that if you are facing challenges, that you make your readers aware of the challenges that you're facing. We were, the Record-Chronicle was one of the papers that participated in the day of editorials pushing back against fake news and or accusations of fake news and the like. And I think it's important to, that you want to own that message that, hey, this is not necessarily right. We don't disagree with something, but let them know and provide accuracy and truth to some of the misinformation that might be out there. Yes?
When you were a college student like us, what's something that you wish you knew then that you've learned since then? Something that you know now that you wish you knew before about journalism?
I cringe sometimes when I look back on what I did as a student journalist, because I made lots of mistakes. I had the I pushed back, but I didn't have the wherewithal or the confidence to do it. I wish I knew how important that human element is the most important part of our stories. I would, a lot of my stories I do great research, I have lots of numbers, lots of data, but I wasn't able to get as much to that intimate level that it connected with everyone regardless of your background. And that's very important, I think, and that's something that I've really come to appreciate, because that's you think about different changes that have happened in our community, in our country, or everything. There's always usually a particular person or particular story that really begins the ripples of change. And as much as we're able to really tell that story and do it fairly and accurately and to where it's intimate, someone really connects it, they're able to see through a different person's eyes. I wish I'd done a little bit more of that, and not as been, cocksure of myself as I was. I'd bang on doors and expect, a response, and sometimes I didn't get it. Any other questions? Yes.
Question. So I would like to be a freelancer because I don't want to. I've heard stories about the Dallas Morning News and about the Southern News, and and I'm like, I don't really. And like you were talking just now, you always have to be under the scrutiny of somebody else to tell you, what's correct. And so, what's your perspective on becoming a freelancer?
Well, you're still going to be. You're still going to be under the scrutiny of whatever editor you're working with as a freelancer. I think, though, that working under the, there's challenges either way, working as a freelancer or working as a full-time staffer. Certainly as a freelancer, you do get to call your shots a little bit more. If you can, it's difficult because our relationship with freelancers, usually the freelancers that we have at the Denton Record-Chronicle, we assign stories to them. We don't have as many stories that are pitched by a freelancer that are published in our paper. Usually it's us assigning stories, it's not coming the other way around. So that is going to be the challenge for you in trying to persuade an editor or a paper or whomever to run the story that you want to run. It's usually we're looking for freelancers that can tackle some of the stories that we're unable to get to. But I do think that there's probably a little bit more difficulty in being a freelancer, not attached to a paper, and being able to have access to some of the sources you're going to need. Because I think that with being under the umbrella of a paper brings you a little bit more access than you're going to find. So what are the challenges that you're seeing in being that you don't want to worry with as far as being a full-time reporter?
We had, I had a professor, and she, for a short period of time, worked for Dallas Morning News, and she had, stories about the community that she and other people in her group thought that should be published. But then every time she was stopped because it was the son of blah blah blah, or the niece, or the friend, or something always related to, okay, these people might not want to read about this, and things like that. So
I've been blessed to not have that pressure in my career, and certainly not to apply that pressure, and not to allow that pressure to be applied to my reporters. And we're blessed at the Record-Chronicle to have a publisher that recognizes that decisions on news coverage rest with the newsroom, not with considering who knows whom. And we're a crazy bunch in the newsroom. If we find out that someone isn't going to like a story that we're going to publish, we're going to go at it even harder. So it's we take it as a challenge. So I would like to believe that that's not reflective of what you're going to find in most newsrooms. And like I said, I've been in a bunch, and I've never had that happen where someone said, hey, we don't want to run this because this guy has some connection to someone.
Thorne, you've had a lot of experience as a freelancer, and yet you still had to sort of answer to editors and people who are making the kinds of decisions that will enable your photographs to be in print or not.
Yeah, being a freelancer doesn't mean that you're necessarily your own boss. You're like a temporary employee for one news organization after another one. So you always have to fit their news standards and go through their editorial process and sometimes bend your stories in a way, and I don't mean bend them in terms of their factual reporting, but I mean in terms of your aesthetics or your style. You have to bend it to the publication. You have to be flexible.
Plus, you don't get any health benefits.
that's true.
Which is a difficult reality in this economy that we have. So.
Yeah. So you can spend your time lobbying for universal health care. I mean, it's actually really quite a stark reality, because I lived in Europe while I was freelancing, and a lot of my colleagues were journalists who were European residents in the Netherlands or in other places, and they didn't have to worry about healthcare, and it made them a lot freer as freelancers.
Yeah, that's what I should do then.
Yeah. I mean, it's
There's no optimal reality. There's no optimal situation. Both have benefits and burdens. I've done both, and you do like the fact that you can sort of pitch your own stories and not get assigned stories, and there's a great deal of freedom in being able to choose sort of the path that you want to go in terms of editorial. But all of a sudden you find yourself with a family and children coming, and you realize you better get on staff somewhere fast. So.
Oh, so you were saying that if I didn't have a husband or children, then I can be freelancing.
Well, you have a mortgage payment. There's a lot of things. Right? There's also the problem of getting enough work, and I know freelancers now who you have to really have a lot of relationships with a lot of different publications, because and you're constantly pitching and constantly looking. Your career might be at a level where you don't have to worry about that, but just starting out, it's a hard way to start out making a living. It really is.
But that's not to say that people don't do it.
No, they do.
But it means that you have a pretty lean existence for a couple of years at least for a couple of years, and it could be longer. And there are people who started staff jobs, and then they get frustrated by the constraints of that, and they figure out a way to afford healthcare on their own.
Yeah.
And then they go freelance. Barbara Davidson, who's coming here to speak on October 4th, was a she was a staffer at the Dallas Morning News and the Los Angeles Times, but she wanted more control of her stories. She took the leap. It was hard for a couple of years, and now she works for National Geographic and other places, very much on a feast or famine cycle. You know, she makes a lot of money in 1 month and maybe nothing at all for 1 month. So there are people who go the other way, and they can figure it out. So it's not to say that it's impossible, but you really have to be a very proactive person in charge of your own entrepreneurial enterprise.
I think you're making more calls as a freelancer than as a full-time reporter, because you're just calling different publications, because you can't do it with just one. I know from our experience, you know, as I'm assigning stories or I'm looking at the budget or overseeing the budget, we're thinking about, you know, where Peggy's going, where Caitlin's going, where Dalton's going. I'm not necessarily seeing as much, it's not to the forefront of the freelance assignments that we're looking at doing.
There are also a lot of freelancers who in the beginning will mix up the type of work that they do. So they do half their work is editorial and half of it might be in advertising or something else. So they'll mix up their assignments, or freelance editing of book manuscripts, and they'll also do reporting 50-50. And then gradually, as you get more of the clients you like, you can let go of the clients that you don't.
That's wonderful.
Anything else, guys? Okay, Sean, thank you so much for coming
Thank you.
here. And students will look forward to our relationship.